The old barn was supposed to disappear before winter. Everyone at Black Hills Ranch knew it. The roof leaned slightly toward the eastern field, the wooden walls were covered with years of rain damage, and the floor had so many weak spots that even the horses avoided walking near it. For almost 15 years, nobody had entered that building unless they had to. It was not a barn anymore. It was a memory nobody wanted to keep. But on a cold morning in November, Daniel Carter stood inside that forgotten building with a flashlight in one hand and an old leather notebook in the other. The wind pushed through the broken walls. The beam of light moved across the empty room. Dust covered everything. Old tools, broken furniture, rusty nails, pieces of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. Daniel slowly opened the notebook. The first page had only one sentence written across it. "Every piece of wood remembers the hands that shaped it." He read the words twice. Then he closed the notebook, because he knew exactly what it felt like to be something people had already decided was worthless. Daniel Carter was 38 years old. He had spent most of his life working with his hands, fixing fences, repairing tractors, building stalls, replacing broken parts on machines that other people had already given up on. He was the kind of man who could hear an engine for 5 seconds and know what was wrong. The kind of man who could look at an old piece of wood and tell if it still had strength hidden inside. But nobody at Black Hills Ranch saw him that way. To them, Daniel was just the ranch worker, the man who arrived before sunrise, the man who left after everyone else, the man who quietly fixed problems nobody noticed. That was why everyone laughed when they heard what happened. When Thomas Whitmore, the wealthy owner of Black Hills Ranch, called Daniel into his office, nobody expected a reward. Thomas Whitmore was known across the state. His ranch covered thousands of acres of land in Montana. His horses were famous. His cattle were expensive. His family name had been connected to the property for generations. People said Thomas could buy anything he wanted. But they also said he had a cold way of looking at people, especially people who worked for him. Daniel walked into the office that afternoon wearing his old work jacket. The room smelled like leather and polished wood. A large window showed the endless fields outside. Thomas sat behind his desk looking through papers. He did not look up immediately. "You wanted to see me?" Daniel asked. Thomas finally lifted his eyes. "I heard you have been asking about the Old West barn." Daniel looked toward the window. The old barn sat far away across the field. "I was just wondering what would happen to it." Thomas leaned back. "Why?" Daniel paused because he had noticed something nobody else cared about. The wood used in that barn was different. The design was different. The way it was built was not random. Someone had created it with patience, with skill. "I think it still has value," Daniel said. For a moment the room was quiet. Then Thomas smiled, not a warm smile, a surprised one. "You think that building has value?" Daniel did not answer. Thomas stood and walked toward a cabinet. He pulled out a set of old keys. The metal made a sharp sound against his hand. "You know what everyone says about that barn?" Daniel looked at him. "That it should be torn down." Thomas placed the keys on the desk. "And they are right." Daniel stared at the keys. "Then why are you giving them to me?" Thomas looked past him toward the fields. "Because you are the only person who believes it is worth saving." Daniel reached for the keys, but before his fingers touched them, Thomas added something. "You can have the barn." The words sounded generous, but something about the way he said it felt different. Daniel looked at him. "For what?" Thomas smiled slightly. "No rent, no cost, nothing." The silence became heavier. Daniel knew nothing at Black Hills Ranch was ever free. Thomas walked back to his desk. "But there is one condition." Daniel waited. "You cannot ask me for money." Another pause. "You cannot use ranch equipment. And you cannot complain when it becomes too much work." Outside the window, the wind moved across the empty land. Daniel looked again toward the old barn, the broken roof, the damaged walls, the impossible amount of work waiting for him. Then he looked back at Thomas. "Why?" Thomas looked confused. "Why what? Why give it to me?" For the first time, Thomas looked away, only for a second, but Daniel noticed. "I already told you." "No," Daniel said quietly. "You told me what everyone sees." Thomas said nothing. Daniel picked up the keys. "What do you see?" The question stayed in the room. Thomas did not answer. Daniel left with the keys in his pocket. That evening he walked across the field alone. The sun dropped behind the mountains. The old barn stood in front of him like a forgotten promise. When he unlocked the door, the hinges screamed. Inside, everything was covered in darkness. But as Daniel stepped forward, something fell from a shelf above him. A small wooden box hit the floor. The lid opened. Inside was a photograph. A young man stood beside the barn decades earlier. Behind him was the same building, the same walls, the same wooden beams, but the man in the photograph was someone Daniel recognized, Thomas Whitmore's father. And standing beside him was Daniel's grandfather. Daniel froze. The photograph shook slightly in his hand, because suddenly the old barn was not just an abandoned building. It was connected to his family. And somehow Thomas Whitmore already knew. Daniel stayed inside the old barn long after the sun disappeared. The flashlight in his hand became the only light in the room. The photograph rested on the wooden table in front of him. Two men stood beside the barn decades ago. One was young Charles Whitmore, the father of the man who now owned Black Hills Ranch. The other was Daniel's grandfather, Samuel Carter. Daniel had seen pictures of his grandfather before. A quiet man, a hardworking man, a man who never talked much about his past. But never once had Daniel heard his name connected to the Whitmore family. He turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded ink, were 4 words: "Built with Trust, 1964. Daniel ran his thumb across the writing. The question became heavier. Why did Thomas give him this barn? Why hide the photograph? And why did his grandfather's name belong to a place everyone had forgotten? The next morning, Daniel arrived before sunrise. The ranch was still covered in darkness. A thin layer of frost covered the grass. The horses moved quietly inside their stalls. Most workers were still asleep. But Daniel was already standing in front of the old barn with a hammer in his hand. The first thing he did was not repair anything. He cleaned. He removed broken boards. He cleared the old tools from the corners. He opened every window that could still move. Fresh air entered the building for the first time in years. For several hours, he worked alone. Then he heard a voice behind him. "You actually came back." Daniel turned. It was Mike Reynolds, one of the younger ranch workers. Mike leaned against the fence, smiling. "You know everyone is betting how long you last." Daniel placed a piece of wood on the ground. "Who's winning?" Mike laughed. 3 days. Daniel looked at the damaged roof. "Only 3? Some people think you will quit tonight." Daniel smiled slightly. He had heard worse things before. Mike looked inside the barn. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel nodded. "Why this place?" Daniel looked around, the broken walls, the empty space, the old wood. "Because someone believed in it once." Mike looked confused. "That's your reason?" Daniel picked up a damaged beam. "No." He looked at the wood carefully. "My reason is that someone gave up on it too soon." Mike watched him for a moment, then he walked away. But the next day he came back, and he brought another worker, then another, not because they believed Daniel would succeed. They came because they wanted to see what he was trying to find. Over the next few weeks, the old barn slowly changed. Not enough for anyone to notice from far away, but enough for Daniel. A repaired wall, a stronger floor, a cleaned workbench, small victories. Every evening after everyone left, Daniel opened the leather notebook he found inside. Most pages contained notes about construction, measurements, wood types, design ideas, but one page was different. It had a message written by his grandfather. Daniel recognized the handwriting from old family letters. "Buildings are easy to measure, people are not." He stopped reading. His eyes stayed on the sentence. Because his grandfather had spent his entire life working with wood, but nobody had ever told Daniel that he built anything at Black Hills Ranch. The following week, Daniel found something hidden behind the old workbench, a small metal box. Inside were several tools, a wooden ruler, and a pocket watch. The watch was broken, the glass was cracked, the hands had stopped at 4:17. Daniel held it carefully. On the back were two letters. S.C. Samuel Carter, his grandfather. For the first time in years, Daniel felt close to a man he barely remembered. He placed the watch beside the notebook, two pieces of the past sitting together. But his progress did not last. 3 days later, Thomas Whitmore arrived at the barn. Daniel knew something was wrong before he even spoke. Thomas stepped inside and looked around. The repairs were visible. The space looked alive again, but Thomas did not smile. "You need to stop." Daniel slowly lowered the piece of wood in his hand. "Stop!" Thomas looked at the walls. "This project is wasting your time." Daniel looked at him. "You gave me the barn. I gave you a chance." Thomas walked closer. "But you are turning it into something else." The words felt strange. "Something else like what?" Thomas looked at the old beams. Then at the notebook sitting on the table. His expression changed for a moment, only a moment, but Daniel saw it. Fear, not anger, fear. Thomas reached toward the notebook. Daniel moved first and picked it up. The two men stood silently. Finally, Thomas whispered, "Where did you find that?" Daniel looked at him. "Why does that matter?" Thomas looked toward the doorway. Outside, the wind moved across the empty fields. Then he said something Daniel never expected. "Because that notebook is the reason your grandfather left this ranch." And suddenly, the old barn was no longer about saving a building. It was about uncovering a truth that had been buried for decades. The words stayed between them. "Your grandfather left this ranch." Daniel looked at Thomas Whitmore, waiting for him to explain, but Thomas said nothing else. He simply turned and walked away. The door of the old barn closed behind him. The sound echoed through the empty space. Daniel stood there alone. The notebook was still in his hand. The broken pocket watch rested on the table. For years, Daniel had believed his grandfather was just a man who worked hard, raised a family, and lived a quiet life. But now every piece of the past seemed connected to this place. The barn, the notebook, the Whitmore family, and a secret nobody wanted to talk about. That night, Daniel did not go home. He stayed inside the barn. The temperature dropped as the wind pushed through the cracks in the walls. He sat beside the old workbench with a small lamp burning beside him. Page after page, line after line, he searched through the notebook. Most of it was about construction, but hidden between measurements and drawings were small notes, personal notes, things his grandfather had written only for himself. One page stopped him. "Sometimes a person can build something beautiful and still lose everything." Daniel read the sentence again. Then below it were 3 names: Samuel Carter, Charles Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore. Daniel closed the notebook. Something happened here, something serious enough to separate 2 families. The next morning, Daniel found Thomas near the main ranch house. The wealthy ranch owner was watching workers move cattle across the field. Daniel walked toward him. "I need answers." Thomas did not turn. "About what?" "You know exactly what." A long silence passed. The wind moved through the tall grass. Finally, Thomas looked at him. "Your grandfather was the best builder this ranch ever had." Daniel was surprised. "Then why did nobody tell me?" Thomas looked down. "Because some stories are easier to bury." Daniel stepped closer. "What happened?" Thomas looked toward the old barn in the distance. "My father and your grandfather built that barn together." Daniel listened carefully. "They designed it differently from every other building here. Your grandfather believed a barn should not just hold animals, it should protect everything inside it." Thomas paused. Believed buildings had a purpose. Daniel looked at the old structure. And then, Thomas's jaw tightened. "My father wanted to expand the ranch. He wanted faster results, more money, more land. And my grandfather, he disagreed." The answer came quietly. "They fought." Daniel waited. Thomas continued. "Your grandfather left." Daniel looked away. "That's all." Thomas did not answer immediately, and that silence told Daniel there was more. "You are hiding something." Thomas looked at him. "You are asking questions you might regret finding answers to." Daniel looked directly into his eyes. "I have spent my whole life being told what I can't become." He held the notebook. "I'm not afraid of the truth." For the first time, Thomas looked at Daniel differently, not like an employee, like someone standing on equal ground. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the barn, but something had changed. He was no longer repairing an abandoned building. He was searching for a missing part of his own family. He worked faster, harder. He repaired the damaged roof section by section. He rebuilt the broken workbench. He restored old tools, and every evening he studied the notebook. Then one night, while removing a damaged floorboard, he found something underneath. A small envelope, hidden beneath the wood. His heart stopped for a second. The paper was old and yellow. His grandfather's handwriting was on the front. "For whoever finds this." Daniel carefully opened it. Inside was a single page, only a few sentences. "Samuel, if you are reading this, then you found the place where everything began." Daniel froze. The letter was not written to him. It was written to someone named Samuel, but the handwriting belonged to his grandfather. He kept reading. "The Whitmore family believes the barn failed because it was too old." A pause. "But they never understood what made it valuable." Daniel looked around the room. The old beams, the wooden walls, the handmade designs. Then he read the final line. "The secret is not inside the barn." His fingers tightened around the paper. "The secret is what this barn was built to protect." A cold wind entered through the broken window. Daniel slowly lifted his head, because suddenly he understood. The barn was never the treasure. It was hiding something someone had spent decades trying to forget. The next morning, Daniel returned to the place where he found the envelope. And beneath the floor, he found a small wooden door. A door that had been hidden for more than 50 years, and on top of it was a faded mark, the same initials carved into the pocket watch. S.C. Samuel Carter. Daniel reached for the handle, but before he opened it, he heard footsteps behind him. Someone was standing at the entrance, someone who had followed him, someone who did not want him to discover what was underneath. Daniel slowly turned around. The old barn became completely still. The wind outside stopped for a moment. The only sound was the quiet movement of footsteps across the wooden floor. Standing in the doorway was Thomas Whitmore. His face was different this time, not the face of a wealthy ranch owner, not the face of a man who controlled thousands of acres. It was the face of someone who had been carrying a heavy secret for a very long time. Daniel kept one hand on the hidden wooden door. "You followed me." Thomas looked at the floor. "I knew you would find it eventually." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Then why did you let me?" Thomas stepped inside because he had no answer. The old man walked slowly toward the hidden door. His boots moved across the same floor that had covered this secret for decades. "My father told me never to open this." Daniel looked at him. "Why?" Thomas looked at the wooden door. "Because he was afraid of what people would find." Daniel felt his chest tight. "What's inside?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I don't know." The answer surprised Daniel. "You don't know?" Thomas shook his head. "My father locked it after your grandfather left. Nobody was allowed near it." Daniel looked at the hidden door. "All these years?" Thomas nodded. "All these years." The two men stood silently. Then Daniel pulled the handle. The door opened with a long, painful sound. A cold smell rose from beneath the floor. Old wood, dust, time. A narrow staircase disappeared into darkness. Thomas grabbed the edge of the wall. For a moment, Daniel thought he was going to stop him, but Thomas stepped aside. Daniel turned on his flashlight and walked down. The room below was smaller than he expected. There were no gold treasures, no valuable objects, only shelves, hundreds of old documents, blueprints, photographs, letters, records from decades ago. Daniel moved the light across the walls, then he stopped. There was a large photograph hanging in the center. It showed his grandfather and Charles Whitmore standing together. But this picture was different. They were not just workers beside a barn, they were partners. Beside the photograph was a handwritten document. Daniel picked it up. His hands became still as he read. The barn was never built as a storage building. It was built as a training workshop, a place where young ranch workers could learn skills, carpentry, machine repair, animal care, construction, a place where people who had no opportunities could create them. Daniel looked around the room. His grandfather had not simply built a barn, he had built a future for people. But then he found another letter. This one was from Charles Whitmore. The words were difficult to read because of the faded ink. "Samuel, I made a mistake," Daniel continued. "My son believes this ranch belongs only to those who already have power. You believe it belongs to those willing to work." Daniel looked at Thomas. Thomas was staring at the letter. His eyes were wet. "My father changed after that," Thomas whispered. Daniel looked at him. "What happened?" Thomas sat on an old wooden box. "When I was young, I watched my father push Samuel away." His voice became quieter. "He thought my grandfather's ideas were too generous. He thought helping others would weaken the ranch." Thomas looked around the room. But years later, he realized he was wrong. Daniel held the letter. "Then why hide this?" Thomas looked down. "Because admitting the truth meant admitting my family destroyed something valuable." The room became silent. For the first time, Daniel saw Thomas not as a rich man, but as someone trapped by the mistakes of people before him. But the discovery did not solve everything. The next week, something unexpected happened. A developer arrived at Black Hills Ranch. They wanted to buy part of the property, including the land where the old barn stood. Daniel watched from a distance as expensive cars entered the ranch. The man leading the group wore a perfect suit and carried a folder filled with papers. Thomas met him outside. Their conversation was quiet, but Daniel noticed Thomas's expression, concern, fear. Later that evening, Thomas came to the barn. "They want this land." Daniel looked up from his workbench. "They can't." Thomas looked at him. "You don't understand. They have an offer." Daniel shook his head. "This place is worth more than money." Thomas looked toward the old walls. "You finally understand." Daniel paused. "What?" Thomas looked at him. "Why I gave you this barn." Daniel waited. Thomas spoke softly. "Because I needed someone who could see what everyone else ignored." But then Thomas handed him another document, a document that changed everything. The developer had discovered the hidden room, and they were claiming ownership of everything inside. Daniel stared at the paper. The truth they had just uncovered was now in danger. The barn they fought to save. The legacy his grandfather left behind. Everything could disappear. And this time, the enemy was not the broken wood. It was time. The rain started before sunrise. Heavy drops hit the roof of the old barn, finding every weak spot in the wood. For 3 years, Daniel Carter had repaired that building piece by piece. But that morning, he stood in the center of the room wondering if all his work was about to disappear. The papers sat on the workbench. The developer wanted the land. They wanted the documents hidden beneath the barn. They wanted everything connected to the history of Black Hills Ranch, and they had money. More money than Daniel could ever imagine. He looked around the room. The repaired walls, the restored tools, the old wooden beams that had survived decades of storms. Then his eyes moved to the leather notebook. The same notebook he found on his first day. The same notebook that started everything. Daniel opened it one more time. Near the back there was a page he had never noticed before, a small note written in his grandfather's handwriting. "If someone finds this place someday, do not protect the building. Protect the reason it was built." Daniel stopped, because suddenly he understood. The barn was never valuable because of the wood. It was valuable because of the people it was meant to help. That morning, Daniel made a decision. He would not fight with money. He would fight with the truth. He called every person who had ever worked on the ranch. Old workers, young workers, neighbors, people who remembered the early days of Black Hills Ranch. At first, nobody understood why, but Daniel brought them to the barn. He showed them the hidden room. He showed them the photographs, the documents, the plans his grandfather and Charles Whitmore created together. And slowly, the story came back to life. An old ranch worker named Robert stood near the doorway holding one of the old blueprints. "I remember this place," he said quietly. Everyone looked at him. "When I was 16, Samuel Carter taught me how to repair engines here." Daniel looked surprised. "You knew my grandfather?" Robert smiled. "He was the reason I stayed on this ranch." One person became two became 10. Soon, people began sharing their own memories, stories that had been forgotten. A young man who learned construction there. A single mother who found work because of skills taught inside that barn. A worker who learned to rebuild farm equipment instead of replacing it. The old building was no longer abandoned. It was filled with voices again. When the developer arrived 2 days later, he expected to see an empty structure. Instead, he found the entire community standing outside. Thomas Whitmore stood beside Daniel. For once, he did not stand in front. He stood beside him. The developer looked around. "You understand this land has financial value?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." The man smiled. "Then you understand why this decision is necessary." Daniel looked back at the barn. "No." The developer frowned. Daniel continued. "You understand the price," a pause, "but you don't understand the value." The words were simple, but everyone heard them. The developer looked at Thomas. "This is your property." Thomas looked toward the old barn, then toward Daniel. For years, Thomas had protected his family name. But now he finally understood what his father and grandfather had fought about. A legacy was not something you owned. It was something you protected. Thomas handed the developer the papers. "We are not selling this land." The developer looked surprised. "You are refusing millions." Thomas looked at the barn. "I spent too long believing money was the same as worth." The deal ended that day, but the story did not. Months later, the old barn opened again, not as a storage building, not as a forgotten piece of property, as the Samuel Carter Workshop, a place where young ranch workers learned skills, a place where people could build something with their hands. Daniel became the person teaching others what his grandfather once taught. Every morning, he walked through the same doorway he entered 3 years earlier with a flashlight and a broken dream. But now the room was different. The walls were stronger. The windows were clean. The workbench stood proudly in the center. And on that workbench sat 3 things: the leather notebook, the broken pocket watch, and the old photograph. The watch still showed 4:17. It never started working again. Daniel never repaired it because he finally understood. Some things are not valuable because they continue moving. Some things are valuable because they remind us where we came from. Years later, people would ask Daniel how he saved the worst barn on the ranch. They expected him to talk about construction, about materials, about hard work, but Daniel always gave the same answer. He would look toward the old wooden walls and say, "Everyone saw a broken building." Then he would smile. "My grandfather saw a place where people could become something." And maybe that was the real reason the barn survived, not because one man repaired it, but because one man believed something forgotten could still have a future. Because sometimes the things the world throws away are not worthless. Sometimes they are waiting for someone patient enough to see what they were always meant to become. If this story touched you, remember that every person and every dream deserves a second chance. Share this story with someone who believes forgotten things can still matter.